Hey everybody, I just wanted to do a video here showing how to apply the EVGA thermal pad mod for the win editions of the EVGA 1000 series graphics cards from NVIDIA. Uh, there was a manufacturing oversight, well more of a design oversight, when they designed these cards, and that certain components on the card wouldn't be thermally conductive as much as they would have liked or at all, which resulted in, well, the cards still performed as advertised. They run phenomenally, especially mine here. However, under extreme overclocking situations or unfavorable environments, some of those components would get so hot that they would actually short internally and explode on the card, which was rather unfortunate because if not destroying your graphics card altogether, it had a very high possibility of actually destroying your machine. That did not happen to me. EVGA offered this free modification for your graphics card that you can apply yourself or send it in to get done, but I never pass up an opportunity to take apart something very complicated and put it back together and hopefully have it work again, which we're trying to do today. It's actually not that hard, and I actually like to explain to people that working on your computer shouldn't be something you should be afraid of. You can work on a computer or any electronic component or product with as much confidence as somebody would work on their car. Most of the components you would deal with nowadays are actually mechanical. It's mostly screws and snap-ons and latches that you just have to plug the components in the slots where they go. So it's not that hard. All you have to do is treat your components with respect, and you can avoid any unfortunate circumstances. Most notably, importantly, is to ground yourself before you work on any component. That eliminates any chance of electrostatic discharge. And that's usually what kills components most. But if you just take care of yourself and take care of the component, we can avoid any problems. Now, they ship you just about everything you need for this modification. They send you the thermal pads, which are right here. They got different sized ones for the different modifications, and as well as some thermal grease. The only things they don't provide for you are a number 1 Phillips screwdriver, which is just a standard size Phillips. And they actually ask that you use some high percentage isopropyl alcohol, which I'm assuming is for cleaning some of the components when you apply the thermal mod, because some of them already have some thermal components on them. But I have something a little higher in for that. I actually have some thermal paste emulsifier, which sounds like a technical term because it kind of is, but all it is just a solvent that will dissolve the thermal paste that was installed on the factory, so I can apply my own. And I will be applying my own thermal paste because while I trust the engineers at EVGA to be giving me good product, I have some pretty high-end thermal paste here myself, and I've trusted that everything from my computer processors to graphics cards to my Xbox even. And it has done me no wrong, and it's pretty good, so we're going to be using that. So, and to explain how easy this guide is, the EVGA instructions they ship with it actually has a chart circling every single screw you need to remove and in what order, and putting it back together is just the same in reverse. It's pretty easy. So I encourage anybody who might have one of these cards to go ahead and go through with this, because while you may not be pushing your card to the high-end expectations that led to some of these cards exploding, I'm always one of the case of why not, okay? I always like to err on the side of caution, and it has done me no wrong. Except maybe a little bit of my time, but you know what? This is one of those things I just like doing, so that's what we're going to keep doing. Now, the actual component that was actually causing some problems in these was the voltage regulator module. Now we weren't even talking about the actual graphics processor unit or the video RAM installed on these cards. It was actually the voltage regulators that service those components, to the point where under extreme conditions your graphics processor and your VRAM could be running at, say, 81 to 85 degrees Celsius, and while that's still very hot, that's actually pretty cool considering the intensity that they're being put under. However, the voltage regulators were actually exceeding over 100 to 105 degrees Celsius, boiling water temperature at that point. So that's quite unfortunate, and that's what caused the failures. So I just removed all the screws, and just double check here. Yeah, I just removed all the screws for the back plate, and next we are going to remove the screws for the actual heatsink for the GPU. So remove the remaining screws in the PCB circle in green. Remove the remaining 4 spring screws in the back of the card to separate the heatsink from the card. Do not remove the bottom right screw circled in gold. Okay, so don't touch that guy. So that is the back plate for the EVGA 1080 for the Win Edition. And I always love the complexity of some of these modern electronic components. It's beautiful to me. But let's see here. We're going to be removing GX1080 for the Win. So 1, 2, 3. So you guys here. And this is where the first time when an ESD or electrostatic discharge would actually affect your component, because we have exposed circuitry that you can come in contact with. And when I say electrostatic discharge, I mean the same thing happens if you rub your socks on the carpet, in the winter when it's all dry out, and you touch somebody, it gives them a good zap. Well, that can be utterly lethal to a computer component as sensitive as these. In fact, it doesn't even require a shock or a discharge that you could even feel. Millivolts can be enough to kill some of these components. And unfortunately, on the human eye level, that's not even enough to even see where the damage was to replace a component. So it's good to always take that precaution to ground yourself. All you got to do is just touch something metal and I usually like to touch the frame of whatever the component I'm working on, as well as touch a doorknob or maybe a screw to a light switch, something that would conduct metal. All you're trying to do is equalize the electrical charge between you and the component to avoid any discharge. So after these come off, the heatsink should pull right off. But I think first we have to disconnect the header connector for the fans and lights on here, because I like to spend expensive money on stuff that lights up and makes me feel like I accomplished something way more awesome than I actually did, which I still think it's awesome, but that's what we're going to do. So make sure I'm doing this right. Always follow the instructions. Don't let anybody tell you you're not a man if you use the instructions, because you know what, at the end of the day you got something that works. For removal of heatsink, you must carefully disconnect the LED and fan connectors first. Recommend a small flathead screwdriver. Bam. Alright. It's not very informative in telling me what I need to do here. Let's see. The connectors may also be carefully removed by your fingers. I thought I knew what I was doing. Shoot. I do. There we go. It was on the end here. Always take your time. There's no need to rush. So yeah, all it has to do here is just kind of pry on this here. Never pull on wires on any kind of plug, just like your wall sockets at home. It's be very damaging. Always pull from the socket. Alright, so that's disconnected. And the little piece I took here is a little piece of silicone cover to cover the connector points if you want to do an SLI or 2 graphics cards at once. I'm not that quite extreme. This guy is pretty awesome by itself. So, make sure. So with that, okay, flipping around. And it also points out that you should be very careful here because, there it goes, these heatsink fins can be very sharp and you do not want to cut yourself. They are just stamped aluminum or copper. That's a Phillips, not a flathead. And they can have sharp edges. So that is the beastly heatsink for the GTX 1080 series from EVGA. And it does a dang good job, but not quite as good of a job as it was supposed to do. So that's what we're here to fix. And you see the square here? It looks like a little rubber or ticky-tack. That's the thermal paste that we're going to be removing. Factories I found that usually put on a little excessive amounts on there, which is safe. They err on the side of caution, just like me. You'd rather have too much than too little of this stuff. But all you need is like the most minimal amount necessary to cover the surface area. You don't need it bleeding over the edges because all it's going to be doing is conducting from that surface to the heatsink. Any excess or more, you'd end up insulating instead of conducting the heat, which would be counterproductive to what you're doing. And these guys right here are the voltage regulator modules, and you can see there's no thermal paste, there's not even a thermal pad, which is what we're going to apply. These are the culprits that are causing the big issues. But we're going to go a step further, and we're going to add some extra thermal pads to the video RAM. We're going to redo the thermal paste for the GPU, and we're going to add another thermal pad here for these guys who haven't been doing their job right because they weren't given the tools they need. So, after removing the LED connector, raise the heatsink. Okay, we did that. So that's page 1. Let's put that aside so we don't get it confused. Alright, note. Okay, I'll get to you later. Note, for simplicity's sake, the following images use the 1080 ACX 3.0, this guy, with the exception of step 7. All our graphics cards follow the same steps to complete the VRAM thermal mod. And yep, that looks like exactly what I have here. So we're going to take this and remove the base plate and set it aside. Peel off the 8 VRAM thermal pads on the base plate outlined in red. So there was thermal pads on here, but apparently they determined they were not up to snuff. Or what do we still got connected here? We don't want to break anything. So there is a screw that I seem to have missed, and I want to go back and verify that that is something we need to take off. does not call for it. Yeah, I'm wondering how it comes off. Being the careful person I am, well, this is something, as my profession dictates, they call a deviation from tech data. And as long as you can justify it with your system knowledge and common sense, this is not an illegal procedure. Granted that it's only showing images for some of the procedures and not, or some of the models, but not all of them. So all of this is one extra screw that holds the back mounting plate on here. So we're gonna reinstall that, make a point of that before we put it together. But there is the raw circuitry of a GTX 1080 graphics card. It's pretty awesome. Over here we have the chips circling the graphics processor, which are actually the video RAM, close where they should be, and then the voltage regulator modules here. So the next step, it says, let me find a safe place to put this. It's not going to get bumped around or touch something it shouldn't. Next step it calls for is to actually remove these thermal pads that are on the base plate. So that's one. Two. Three. 4 and 5, 6, 7, 8. Now I can kind of see where they were going with this. The thermal pads they had on here were only the size necessary to cover the video RAM. But like I mentioned earlier with the thermal paste on processors and other components, you only need exactly as much as you need to cover the area. However, like I said, the manufacturers like to err on the side of caution sometimes. Better have too much than too less. So the components that they gave us to replace them are actually whole strips to cover the entirety of all of the VRAM chips all at once, as opposed to one individual for each. Wow. They actually hot glued it on here. There's plastic covering these, so it isn't, my thermal pads aren't ruined, but they're there. And here's the little thermal paste they give you in the package. I'm not going to use that. Made in Taiwan, yeah. See, the stuff I've got here, not that Taiwan makes bad components, but made in the USA. Arctic silver, high density polysynthetic silver thermal compound. Yeah, it's high tech stuff. So here's the first piece of, our first tool, which I did not bring in here with me. I will be right back. The first thing that it calls for that most people may not have is a high percentage isopropyl alcohol and some Q-tips to apply it. And what we're going to do here is actually just clean the VRAM chips from any of the glue material that held those old thermal pads on. So lint-free cloth on high percentage alcohol, gently clean GPU and VRAM memory chips. So we're going to start here with the actual base plate. So we want to make sure we got all our bases covered. I go very thorough with my cleaning applications, both with this stuff and with my work. So make sure that that's all done. And while this may not be a lint-free cloth, I just pay extreme attention to detail to make sure I'm not leaving any residues or lint around. Okay, and so let's bust out the actual GPU here. So yeah, there's a little bit of residue on those, so we're gonna apply it to that. Now I'm gonna be using the alcohol here for the VRAM, but I'm going to be using my remover solution for the actual GPU. Now the reason why we use alcohol and not just say like, you know, purified water is one, it actually is kind of a solvent more so than water, and so certain contaminants or residues are picked up easier with alcohol than just water. But we all know that water is a conductor of electricity, and if there is any residual water left on the circuit board when you try to power it back up, it could very easily short out components with water left on the board. Where not only is alcohol a good cleaning solution for this, but it also allows the water to dry up much quicker along with the alcohol. And so there's a very little possibility that there will be enough water left by the time you put it all back together to actually cause a electrical short. So now, for this as well as the heatsink, I'm going to be applying this solution to dissolve the thermal compound. And not everybody needs this. This is just a little more thorough application to make sure it's clean in the way I like it. Isopropyl alcohol should work just fine, but this works a little quicker and it's a little cleaner because it actually dissolves it into the liquid, which I can just wipe up and then toss away and then apply the new stuff. This is a two-part solution. The first is the actual remover, which will dissolve the old thermal paste. Let's speed things up here. I don't want to keep you waiting. And the other is actually a purifier, which kind of removes some of the residue from the processor and the heatsink. So when you apply the new paste, your new paste isn't being dissolved just the way as the old stuff was. So and sometimes this takes more than one application because, like I said, the factories like to lay it on thick sometimes. See? EVGA, made in Taiwan. I'm not saying Taiwan makes bad components, just saying that I feel like I got some better thermal conductivity compound. Not everything's made the same. See, it's really thick here on the heatsink, so I may actually need a third application here. But while that's working, I'm going to read ahead a little bit. Gently squeeze thermal grease to distribute the grease in the packet. cut the end of the packet and place a small amount of thermal paste on the GPU. Install the included VRAM thermal pads directly onto the memory chips. Make sure to remove the plastic on both sides. Next, place the back plate back on the PCB. The adhesive and thermal pad should hold the base plate in place. So they're acting as more of a, or not more, but also as a structural mount as well to keep everything in place. So that's good. It's probably why they opted for the whole strips as opposed to individual ones. Wow, this stuff is wanting to stick in those little corners. These tiny little capacitors all around the GPU. In fact, I think this should be a job for Q-tip. I'm sorry, this is probably the most lengthy part of the whole process, mostly just because I'm a stickler for details and I like things to be clean. Very nice and shiny. When you, especially with processor units like these, you're probably mostly going to be sure that all the compound is removed when you have a nice shiny mirror finish, because they like to make those chip dies out of silicon or silver sometimes, yes, silver, or just very, very thermally conductive materials, and so it's usually a very pure metal, and that they like to have a nice sheen on them when they're perfectly clean. So that's your good indication that you've got all the material off. Now this has been sitting over here, so this will probably come right up. Yeah. There's a little bit of residue. We're gonna hit that one more time, but there's not much. It shouldn't take very long. Now this stuff isn't necessarily toxic, the stuff I'm using, but it's probably also not a good idea just to be hanging around it all day or sniffing the fumes, just like marker. But like I said, just treat everything you have with respect and you should have no problems. Yeah, that's nice and clean. Alright then, well, let's get that stuff out of the way. Now we're going to add a little bit of this purifier here. And it says, I think, yeah, you just need to wipe it away. You don't need to wait for this stuff to dissolve. Counteracts that remover pretty quickly. Now, in the middle of this, I was just thinking to myself, this is probably the most expensive component I've ever actually broken down and applied this sort of stuff to. I've done it to my processors for my computers many a times, but never had a single component that was worth more than one of those. because this is just a lot more than the processors I normally work on. I'm wondering if I should clean those guys up. No, I'm gonna leave those alone. That's there's a couple other chips here that are probably part of the voltage regulators, but they have their own uh, thermal plate or thermal pad here, and it has a little bit of grease on it. That's what we kind of cleaned off before, and I'm sure that's some part of the thermal conductivity compound. So I'm going to leave that there because this kit doesn't include any of the pads to replace those specifically. So we're going to leave those guys alone. So now's the fun part. We are going to apply just a small amount of my super high-tech thermal paste. And the goal here, like I mentioned before, is to only apply enough to cover exactly the surface area you need. And I'll be right back because there's one tiny little tool that I need. So, to apply the thermal paste in the most even manner possible, the best tool I've been advised to use is actually a business card. In this case, I'm actually going to be using a little membership card that you throw on your keychain. Just something hard and flat that you can use to spread this out. And all you want to do is just get a nice even coat across the top surface of the chip. You're aiming for conductivity and nothing more, so the least amount to accomplish your task, the better. Need just a little bit more. Always apply in gentle amounts. You don't need to overdo it. And it's actually okay if this actually, because it can get very stringy, especially if it starts getting a little old. If it drapes over some of the other components on the circuit board, it's not going to hurt it at all. The only things that really need heat sinking are these high-end components right here in the middle. So it wouldn't hurt anything like the small little capacitors or transistors, or especially resistors all across the board. It's not really going to hurt it much. So yeah, that's it. Just enough to cover the surface area. And when you'll press that on here, it'll smush out what little there is if it's applied firmly. And when it does that, it'll push out just a little bit more around the edges, because again, that's the goal here, is to cover just the amount of surface area you need, and that'll put a thin bead around the side of it as well, giving you conductivity there. So I'm actually covering the whole chip, but it's not going to happen right on the very front. So we have applied that there. Now we install the provided VRAM thermal pads. Same material as the stuff before. It's going to be sticky on that side, so we're going to put that side down. I'm taking my time with this. Always do it right the first time. So if you'll notice, and this is if you're doing this same mod as I am, there's an outline around the GPU just in front of all the VRAM slot chips, and that's actually the outline of where this heatsink base plate is going to go. So when you're applying these, they should cover the chips, but should not exceed that line. They shouldn't go over it, because that could obstruct the application or the connection between the base plate and the processor here. So you want to try and leave that clear. You don't want to do quite the opposite of what this mod is supposed to do. It's just little things you want to take into consideration. And again, if you really, I'm doing this video to help out you guys, but if you don't feel confident in doing this procedure, you are more than welcome to contact EVGA and they will do it for you. And I'm not one to wait, and I like doing complicated stuff, so there we go. Those are all applied. Alright, at this point, if you do not plan on adding thermal pads to the base plate or back plate, please skip to step 11 to complete the VRAM thermal pad mod. We are going a step further, so we're going to keep going. Apply the narrow thermal pad to the area marked in the image. Always keep your work area clean, otherwise you start getting confused and things get lost. So we're moving on to the bigger thermal pads now. So on the base plate here, which we actually are going to reapply. Last thing you want to do is do something wrong. Okay, so you're putting these back on here. Most importantly, you have to remember, since I did remove a screw that was not outlined, that's the first to be reinstalled. You want to, when you're reassembling a component, you want to do it exactly in the reversed order to avoid any complications, any at all. You do not want any of that. So, I only loosely tighten it on there because we want a little bit of flexibility here. Now this is the thermal pad that's going to give us that safety margin and actually properly cool the voltage regulators on these cards. Put hot glue on this one too. There we go. Come on. Come on. Stubborn little bugger. There we go. Alrighty. So this long john here, let's put the sticky side down so it stays when it's supposed to be. It's going to cover up all the VRAM chips here. And don't stretch. They're fairly stretchy, so don't stretch them too much. They could be too thin to do their job, and it would end up hanging over the edges. So it's a good idea to press it down. Don't crush it because you don't want to break anything. But just press it just enough. Make sure you're getting good contact between the base plate here and the chips, which I don't know if you could see, but there's just a slight rectangular outline of the voltage regulators there. With that applied, that's on there. Make sure the thermal pad does not extend beyond the edges of the base plate. See, important. After adding the thermal pad, reconnect the fan connector to the PCB, reconnect the LED connector, and carefully place the heatsink back on the GPU. Again, carefully turn the card over. Take care when holding the heatsink as the fins may be sharp. Reverse step 2 by fastening all 4 spring screws and any remaining screws depending on the graphics card model. At this point, the base plate thermal pad mod is complete. If you choose not to do the back plate thermal pod, then please skip to step 15. We're going to be doing the whole shebang here, both for you and for me, because why not go above and beyond? So, we're actually most of the way through now. So since this is the confirmed configuration, I want to make sure this guy's tightened back down. This guy too, didn't touch him, but never hurts to verify. And one of the things it does point out in these instruction manuals that I did not read out loud is that you should be very careful when applying these or screwing these screws back in, because they're so tiny you could very easily strip them out, and that would be most unfortunate. Not that it would ruin the function of the card, but you would have a little less of a firmer hold on the back plate, which could again affect the efficiency of your cooling here. Alright, here I'm gonna need, it's one of those moments where you feel like you need a third hand. Electrical connectors like these usually aren't fun, especially if you're having to push two things together but not crush them. There we go. Let's make sure it's firmly seated. One of the connectors here is right here in the end. If you were like me early on and I couldn't figure out where it's at, it's right here. I just use this little flathead screwdriver just to give myself a little bit more leverage in there. Just trying to even fit it on the connector is kind of hard enough. Almost there. There we go. Alright, at this point your thermal paste and your thermal pad, which You can see our thermal pad right there. Our thermal paste is right here in the middle. Should be pressing pretty firmly together. So just want to make sure. Again, you don't want to crush it. You just want to make sure they're together. Now we're going to carefully flip her over. And we're going to put all our screws back in. Well, most of the screws, some of the screws, not quite there yet. Things are lined up correctly. These screws should just screw right in, which they are. If they end up not screwing in, you just have to readjust the back plate with the circuit board of the actual main card. And just scoot it around a little bit. Don't go too much with it, because then you'll end up smearing that thermal paste around and potentially cutting the actual thermal pad you installed on the voltage regulators and the memory chips, because some of those are making direct contact with the fins to ensure that thermal conductivity. And with my card here, we have 1, 2, 3 screws here. 1080 for the Win Edition. Quite go in the hole. There we go. And you'll notice too, all these screws, and that's why I kind of say, if you want to ground yourself, that was crazy. It just fell off. Nothing's hurt. If you notice all these screws, they have like this little orange or bronze looking like ring around them that's actually copper. That means they're actually part of the grounding construction of the circuit board itself. So all certain components that need a connection to electrical ground goes into like the main chassis of the board. So that's why if you want to ground yourself to a component to eliminate electrostatic discharges, you'd want to try and contact the metal frame of the device. And usually your best bet are these mounting screws, because even if there was an electrostatic discharge, when you do ground yourself, you'd be discharging to one of these screws, and you're not going to hurt a screw with an ESD. So, all right, let's see here. So we're going to set that right there. Well, let's go back to our back plate here, because we're installing a new mod here. So it says here, place the back plate you removed in step 1 on its back. Remove and discard the outlined rubber standoffs. So that'll be this guy right here. Now, normally these are just keeping the card spaced out from the back plate, so it wouldn't be loose. But we will be replacing them with our thermal pad, which should just be these first two here on this metal grate here. And be careful on these, because these little plastic grates, they like to break easily, so you don't want to damage the aesthetics of your very expensive and very well performing product. You want it to look as good as it performs. Just a little bit of glue residue here, I'm just peeling off. And there's a little bit here, but that's probably not going to come off that, so that's fine. This is the inside of the card. So that page is done, so we'll move to the next one. Next, apply the wide thermal pad to the back plate. Move the plastic on one side and place the thermal pad strip area over the area outlined in the image. Finally, remove the plastic cover from the other side of the pad. see if we can take this off without ripping it off before, yeah. And again, you do not want to stretch or move this around much. You want it to just cover the areas necessary, which is, it gives you a little more margin for error on this one. Just spread it out. And all this will do, this will ensure that there's a little bit of a connection. Just rubbing that up against that screw mount, but that's not going to matter. There's a better connection with the board, and it turns the backplate here into actually something more functional than just an aesthetic backplate. I actually put a little bit of cooling on the back side of this whole. This is where the voltage regulators are on the other side. So this will cover this whole area and add an actual extra level of heat sinking to the card, which, good job EVGA, you thought ahead, covering all your bases. So now that that's on there, make sure it's applied firmly. Before you reinstall a backplate, make sure you have first reverse step 2, which is install the screws and the spring screws. Now reverse step 1, placing the backplate on the back of the card. Refasten any screws you remove depending on your card model. And that completes the backplate thermal mod. Thermal pad mod. So if everything goes smoothly as it has so far, when we put this guy back in the computer, it should fire right up with a renewed sense of purpose and confident that it can push itself to the extremes. So yeah, that's the simplicity of the thermal pad mod for the EVGA 1000 series graphics cards. Not all of them. The Founders Edition cards are all fine because those are the NVIDIA designed and manufactured. Just these, there's just a few select models from EVGA that were affected by this. Not all of them, but some of them. And like I said, it wasn't very critical for most consumers, but it doesn't hurt to have a little extra overhead to make you feel safe and help you sleep better at night. But that's pretty simple. Again, don't be afraid to get technical with your electronic products. It's not hard to do these things. You didn't notice I didn't bust out a soldering iron, I didn't bust out a multimeter, didn't have to check continuity. Only wires I disconnected were just simple plugs, while small to get to. They were very easy to disconnect and reconnect. They only go together one way. It's easy, so I encourage everybody to dig into their components and try and fix them if you have the instruction manuals and the tools to get in there and fix your own stuff. Because let's be honest, we're a very consumer-based economy, and most of us would sooner just buy something new than try and fix it ourselves, and that's way too expensive. You have the power, you have the capability, you have the information at your fingertips with the World Wide Web to tell you everything you need to do. So I hope that has been very informative to you all, and hopefully this inspire you all to get your tools out, fix some things you never thought you could fix before. Well, there you have it. EVGA 1080 For the Win edition, thermal pad mod complete. Let's throw her back.